They did not just torch houses and shops. They tried to wipe out memories, families, futures, and then pretend those places were never there at all. Picture a street glowing under gas lamps, laughter spilling from cafes, a newspaper fresh off the press telling local kids about a school play. Picture doctors, lawyers, teachers, barbers, bakers, and bankers who all look like each other and look like me. That was Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, on the last day of May in 1921. Wealthy by any standard, nicknamed Black Wall Street, it showed the world that Black Americans could thrive on their own terms. Then came dawn, rumor, and flame. By sunrise on June 1st, 300 souls were missing or dead. 35 square city blocks were cinders. Airplanes had dropped bottles of dynamite on crowded rooftops, and a police chief signed off on it with a shrug. Insurance companies tossed every claim in the trash. The city kept photographs in a locked filing cabinet. For 60 years, local kids grew up on that land without a single classroom lesson about what had been stolen. That is one town. There are dozens. Some tragedies shout, others whisper for a century, waiting for someone to lean in. Rosewood, Florida, started as 8 narrow streets of cedar cottages. It had a baseball team, 2 churches, a lumber yard, and a vigil every New Year where neighbors lit lanterns on the river and prayed for another peaceful harvest. On the first days of January 1923, a white woman in a nearby hamlet claimed a black assailant had bruised her. Newspapers printed the accusation in large, bold type. White men packed rifles into cars and roared through Rosewood's lanes. They burned each home after looting the piano or sewing machine inside. A mother hid under a porch, clutching her 2 sons, while smoke turned the sunrise red. Some families escaped by train because an engineer dared to stop in the scrub and haul silent, trembling passengers into boxcars. Nobody was convicted. Every deed to that land changed hands. For 70 years, the story stayed buried until survivors in their 80s testified before the Florida legislature and forced the first public apology. By then, almost every eyewitness was gone. The pattern was older than either massacre. In Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, Black and white progressives had won local elections. Their city government was half black, half white, united by business and newspaper alliances. Enraged white supremacists drafted a speech they called the White Declaration of Independence. They marched with rifles to City Hall, forced officials to resign at gunpoint, stuffed ballot boxes, and fired a Gatling gun into a crowd of fleeing citizens. They killed at least 60 people and banished thousands more, then rewrote the official record to call it a race riot. No state court reversed a single stolen office. History textbooks left a blank space. Ocoee, Florida, Election Day, 1920. A black farmer named Mose Norman attempted to vote. Poll workers mocked him and shoved him away. When he returned with a shotgun for protection, news spread that black men were arming themselves, and white mobs lit torches. They lynched Julius July Perry, shot at anyone crossing a street, and set fire to every house in the black district. Bodies were tossed into wells, citrus groves caught fire, and the roar sounded like a faraway hurricane. After that night, no black family lived in Ocoee for the next 60 years. The orange groves kept growing, fertilized by silence. East Street Louis, Illinois, in 1917, was an industrial magnet. Steel mills and slaughterhouses offered wages slightly better than sharecropping, so black families rode trains north. Their success angered local white unions who feared cheaper competition. On a blistering July afternoon, whites drove through black neighborhoods, shooting revolvers into porches. When frightened residents fired back, the newspapers printed headlines accusing black citizens of revolt. The next day, mobs poured gasoline onto wooden tenements, beating mothers who ran outside carrying children. Witnesses watched men throw infants into the Mississippi River. Official death toll, 39. Scholars estimate 200. Again, the word riot appeared, framing victims as agitators. The governor called for calm and then moved on to the next headline. Elaine, Arkansas in 1919, offers another bitter echo. Cotton prices were soaring, but black sharecroppers never saw their fair share because planters rigged the scales. So, the sharecroppers met in a church to discuss forming a union. White men found out, surrounded the church, and fired into the windows. The farmers shot back in fear. County officials called for help. Hundreds of white men plus federal troops stormed the countryside, hunting anyone with dark skin. By the time the gunfire stopped, as many as 200 black Arkansans lay dead. 12 union organizers were arrested, tortured, and rushed through sham trials. They received death sentences for starting the violence. Years later, the Supreme Court finally overturned those convictions, but nobody faced charges for the slaughter. These stories are not footnotes. They are a map of lost wealth. Picture a ledger. On one side, a black carpenter in Greenwood deposits $4,000 in 1920 money to build a duplex. On the other, the duplex burns, and the city council rezones the land, selling it cheap to a rail company while the carpenter sleeps under a Red Cross tent. Multiply that by thousands of carpenters, teachers, and nurses across dozens of towns, and the lost generational wealth climbs into the billions. Every charred pharmacy was a college fund gone. Every scorched insurance policy was a down payment vanished. Economists calculate that Greenwood alone might have produced $200 million in property value today if left to grow. Instead, survivors scattered to Chicago, Los Angeles, Kansas City, hauling grief in cardboard suitcases. Why did these towns thrive in the first place? After emancipation, formerly enslaved people wanted land and safety more than anything. Some headed west with a dream of all-black settlements. They read about Nicodemus, Kansas, a prairie town founded in 1877. They heard about Boley, Oklahoma, which by 1910 had its own electric company, bank, and 40 schools. These places became magnets, proving independence was possible. Newspapers run by black editors printed editorials, bragging that wheat harvests in Boley matched any county in Texas. Booker T. Washington toured these towns and praised their self-reliance. Railroads noticed too, profiting from freight contracts and passenger tickets. Ironically, the same railroads later carried white mobs in cattle cars to destroy them. The mobs did not appear from thin air. They grew from local papers that printed headlines like, "Negro brutally attacks white girl," with no evidence. They grew from sheriffs who deputized men on the spot, handing out rifles paid for by county taxes. They grew from politicians running on slogans about protecting white womanhood. They grew from federal silence that signaled black life was cheap. And they grew from envy. Greenwood's hotels had chandeliers. Rosewood's households had pianos. The success stung like a mirror showing a lie in the American myth of racial hierarchy. The easiest way to shatter that mirror was fire. Listen to survivor Olivia Hooker, 6 years old on the night Greenwood burned. She hid under a table while soldiers stomped through her house, breaking a piano and stealing her father's wristwatch. Decades later, she joined the Coast Guard, became the first black woman in active duty, earned a PhD, and campaigned for reparations. She lived to 103 years old and said the sound of splintering wood never left her dreams. Stories like hers turned statistics back into breathing human beings. Look at the legal aftermath. Courts routinely labeled massacres as riots, a trick that voided insurance coverage because most policies excluded riot damage. City councils used eminent domain to seize cleared land for railroad spurs or industrial parks, pushing former owners into homelessness. When Tulsa's survivors filed civil suits, judges dismissed them for lack of evidence, ignoring sworn affidavits because they contradicted police testimony. In Elaine, authorities blamed the union meeting and claimed the slain sharecroppers were planning an uprising. That narrative stuck for half a century until buried court records surfaced. Even the census can be a weapon. After Rosewood burned, the 1930 census recorded a population of exactly 0 in that township. Officially, nothing happened. A blank line cannot scream. Skip forward to the Great Migration. Millions of black residents fled Southern terror for northern jobs. They carried with them folk songs about burning churches and whispered advice to never answer the door after dark. They built new neighborhoods but faced redlining, covenants, and urban renewal bulldozers. The cycle shifted from open flame to bureaucratic erasure, but the aim stayed the same: contain black progress. Yet memory has a stubborn heartbeat. In the 1990s, Tulsa city officials finally convened a commission to investigate the massacre. Researchers used ground-penetrating radar to locate mass graves. College students interviewed grandchildren of survivors. Forensic experts began exhuming remains in 2020. The work is slow, painful, and political, but bones do not lie. They rise and demand a name. Florida's legislature passed the Rosewood Claims Bill in 1994, awarding $2 million split among 9 living survivors and a scholarship fund. Skeptics called it hush money. Survivors called it proof that persistence matters even after 70 years. Wilmington now holds walking tours where guides explain how white businessmen seized the local newspaper, burned it, and installed their own editor. High school textbooks in North Carolina finally include a chapter on the coup. In East Street Louis, memorial sculptures show figures leaping over flames, though many residents still drive past without knowing why the bronze people run. But awareness is not justice. Most properties were never returned. Heirs of Greenwood homeowners still fight zoning boards. Heirs of Rosewood families still cannot plant mailboxes on land where their grandparents harvested cedar. The value appreciation lost to 20th century violence compounds every year, widening the racial wealth gap. Economists call it a legacy cost. Survivors call it theft. The larger question is why these stories slipped from national memory. Part of the answer is control of education. School boards decide which chapters fit neatly into patriotic narratives. Another part is social comfort. People prefer tidy arcs. Slavery ended, Martin marched, everything fine. Massacres complicate that arc with smoke and dynamite. Finally, there is fear. Acknowledging stolen wealth raises moral and financial debts. Debts create pressure for repayment. Yet forgetting has its own cost. When a nation hides history, it risks repeating horrors. In 2015, white supremacist gunman Dylan Roof referenced old fears of black-built power before shooting worshippers in Charleston. In 2017, protesters marching in Charlottesville chanted slogans straight from 1920s pamphlets. The flame that destroyed Greenwood never fully died. It flickers in each generation unless smothered by exposure and accountability. So, what do we do with the knowledge? First, we tell the stories in full voice, on screens, in classrooms, across dinner tables. Second, we follow the money. Land deeds exist. Title abstracts exist. University archives store insurance ledgers, bank receipts, and zoning maps. Digital volunteers now scan thousands of pages, piecing together who owned which parcel in Tulsa on May 31, 1921. Third, we pressure institutions to open files. The National Archives still holds records from the Red Summer of 1919 sealed behind fragile catalog numbers. Fourth, we dream forward. Projects like the Greenwood Rising Museum use augmented reality to show visitors what Black Wall Street looked like before the bombs. Kids wearing headsets can walk through digital sidewalks lined with barber poles and newspaper stands. Technology can rebuild memory even when bricks are gone. Some argue that bringing up past massacres only stirs division. Survivors answer that division already burns when truth is buried. Sunlight does not create disease. It reveals it so healing can begin. Justice delayed is still possible. Germany pays Holocaust pensions. Canada compensates First Nations for residential schools. America can face its own ashes. Remember the #1 rule of fire. It needs oxygen. Starve it, and it dies. Hate needs ignorance. Feed people facts, context, empathy, and the embers lose heat. When you know Olivia Hooker's watch was stolen, you recognize the weight of a single heirloom, and maybe you guard others' heirlooms with more care. Imagine a different timeline. Greenwood keeps compounding wealth, invests in factories, funds scholarships, pioneers tech startups, becomes a regional powerhouse attracting global investors. Its success inspires similar ventures in Alabama, Texas, and Georgia. The wealth gap narrows by billions. The music of jazz evolves and bustling black nightclubs flush with local patronage. A senator from Greenwood proposes civil rights bills in 1930 instead of 1964. Entire cascades of history shift. That alternate timeline is gone, but understanding what was possible reveals what might be rebuilt. Step back and trace a line from Wilmington's coup to voter suppression laws passed today. The tactics change, but the goal stays: block power. Step back further and notice how stories labeled riots usually follow black progress. Chicago, Detroit, Watts, Newark. When jobs open up, resentment ignites. The pattern is a teacher if we pay attention. Let us pay attention to Ocoee, Oklahoma, the town that did not burn. It survived because the railroad moved, leaving fewer economic targets, but its legacy proves fire was not inevitable. Given space, black towns could endure, innovate, and contribute to the broader economy. Ocoee's bank once loaned money to white farmers during a drought. Prosperity is not a zero-sum game. Consider the children who return each year to Tulsa's Juneteenth festival. They dance on streets once coated in ash. They design T-shirts with slogans like, "We are still here." Their grandparents feared mentioning the massacre. Their parents whispered about it at church. They live stream it now, reaching millions. Memory is contagious. If you feel anger rising, hold it. Let it power curiosity, conversation, and action. Read survivor memoirs. Support local history projects. Ask schools if they teach these events. Vote for leaders who protect accurate curricula. Volunteer to digitize archival documents. Donate to scholarship funds named after victims. Small acts stack up as surely as small fires raised whole neighborhoods. Look again at the definition of riot. A riot suggests chaos without purpose, violence without a plan. But these massacres followed plans. They cleared desirable land, crushed competition, and silenced political voices. That is not a riot. That is organized racial cleansing. Language matters because language shapes memory. When we correct the word, we correct the story. In 2021, on the centennial of the Greenwood Massacre, survivors testified before Congress. Viola Fletcher, 107 years old, described smelling smoke and seeing bodies. She said she had never been paid for the loss of her family home. Lawmakers listened, some in tears, then pivoted to other business. That is how history often ends. A hearing, a news clip, a shrug. Our job is to refuse the shrug. Here is a challenge. Over the next week, tell one person the story of a town on this list. Maybe your sibling, co-worker, or the kid you coach in basketball. When they say they never heard of it, watch their eyes widen. That moment is a spark of understanding. Enough sparks light up a night sky brighter than any fire used to destroy. Now inhale. Remember the names: Greenwood, Rosewood, Ocoee, East Street Lewis, Wilmington, Elaine. Remember the people: Olivia Hooker, Mose Norman, Julius Perry, Viola Fletcher. They were teachers, entrepreneurs, voters, children. They deserved tomorrow. Exhale. Tomorrow is still ours to shape. Tap the video on the screen to see how one survivor rebuilt everything from scratch and refused to stay silent.